immigration has become an emergency politics. And it used to not be that. It used to be that the European Union would deliberately, after thinking about it, admit certain countries, and then those countries would supply influxes of labor, but only so many people because those countries were only so large, but you would have some ability to regulate that. As a consequence of the Iraq War and the Arab Spring, and to some degree climate change, there's been a loss of control over the migration mechanism. And the left was not able to deal with the fact that it's a different argument. A refugee crisis is very different. And to be fair, at the time, I myself said, how can you have a refugee crisis? You've got to do something. You've got to do something. The thing that they should have done is not create the refugee crisis in the first place by not bombing the hell out of Libya and by not invading Iraq. But, once you do these things and you kick this stuff off, then it becomes very difficult to find a way of navigating it that's politically tractable.
Well, that's what they're doing with Iran right now.
Yeah.
This situation in Iran is just an impending refugee crisis in the making. But what I find interesting is that parts of the right have now increasingly come to awareness that to solve migration requires something beyond the nation state. Regardless of, we're not sure where it's going to lead or if it's going to work. But Meloni seems to be gesturing in that direction. Giorgia Meloni I don't know if you saw, has encouraged other European states to forgive the debts of various African countries, collaborating on border policy to prevent people from entering Europe.
Right. One of the strategies is to try to pay off the post-colonial state, to try to get the post-colonial states to help. Of course, many of these post-colonial states recognize that they can use European leaders' concern about winning elections to extract a lot of payment. So this has been a recurrent issue. Turkey, Egypt, Haftar in Libya, wanting things in exchange for controlling migration. Because as far as post-colonial states are concerned, and I think, it's understandable why they would feel this way.
A lot of labor drain too.
Yeah.
Especially countries like Nigeria, which,
a lot of brain drain. Yeah. It's a problem for them. So it's a very difficult thing to resolve, even with regional politics, even say European Union-wide.
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world. And that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish. And because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
You want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I am here with favorite guest, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD at Cambridge, political theorist, author of 2 books, both of which we've discussed on the channel before, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies and the Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. Today, we're going to discuss a very, very, very pressing situation, one in which I'm worried to discuss because, like all situations that are still happening, sometimes it can be dated, and that's why I tend to avoid anything that's news related. But I think the crux of the big thing everyone was waiting for has happened, which is there going to be a war with Iran? Well, now there is, in the sense of there's been by far the biggest escalation we've seen since the one last year. Ayatollah has been assassinated officially. And a lot of the top leadership of the IRGC in Iran has been taken out. What will happen after is still up in the air. But the stuff that a lot of people are wondering is stuff we probably won't know for a very long time, which is what is going to be the aftermath of this war. What are the expectations that various sides have and what they want to see getting out of this? And what I always like about your analysis, Ben, is because you kind of refrain from maybe even too much to the audience's liking from giving your sort of normative judgment as to what you think is good or bad, and more try to objectively analyze a situation for what it is and understand it, which I think is useful because, these days when I Google stuff, just like to, see what's happening, I can't get anything out of like left or right media outlets that are usually heavily centered on a narrative. Like the right ones, of course, just want to, talk about how great, the Israeli US operation is and how it's so great that they're destroying the number one threat to America. And on the left, there's this idea that this will be like Iraq and Syria and all that. And it's like, yeah, well, that's highly possibly the case. But I mean, what does this tell us, right? What does this tell us about? I want to actually understand what's going on. But yeah, people are dying to hear your analysis of the situation in Iran. So you feel free to start wherever you think is best.
Yeah, so I like to focus on the question of what can happen as opposed to how should you feel, because most of the time the way you feel about foreign policy doesn't matter anyway. You don't have any power to affect it. What can happen? What are the possibilities from here? So at the time that we're recording, the oil price has come up to about $80 a barrel. So it's up significantly versus before the war started when it was around 67. Okay, it's come up significantly, but it's still a lot lower than it was during the opening phase of the Ukraine war in 2022 or during the first term of the Obama administration before all the fracking wells were dug. Back then, it was over $100 a barrel and even as high as 120, 125 at points. So the oil prices have come up, but they are not at unprecedented levels. We don't have something that looks like yet the oil shock of 1979 or 1973. It's possible that it could develop in something like that direction, but so far we haven't seen that. And that has to do with the shale oil drilling, which has increased the supply of oil in other parts of the world that were previously not heavy drilling areas. And then it's also due
like the US
to like North America,
right.
Canada, and the United States. And then also it's due to the construction of additional pipelines that make the world less reliant on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, shipping in the Persian Gulf. That's not to say that the Strait of Hormuz doesn't matter. Something like 20% of all oil before this war began passed through the Strait of Hormuz. But constructing this additional infrastructure means that they may be able to reduce that percentage without dramatic rises in the oil price, certainly over a more extended unit of time than we've seen so far. So this is, I think, the major question in terms of opinion in the United States, because in the United States, there's a cost of living crisis that affects everybody in society very nearly. And this cost of living crisis will get juiced by any major spike in the oil price that's prolonged. And it will create a dilemma for the Federal Reserve because higher oil prices will lead to more inflation, which will make the Federal Reserve think it needs to jack the interest rate up. And yet at the same time, higher oil prices tend to reduce consumption and reduce economic activity. So oil shocks are very deadly for monetary policy because they produce stagflation. They produce a situation where you have both inflation because the oil price going up makes the transportation of everything more expensive. So the price of everything becomes more expensive. And then also because everything is becoming more expensive at such a high speed, it also produces a reduction in consumption. And that dual pressure is not something that can be dealt with by monetary policy alone. There is no purely monetarist solution to an oil shock. For that reason, the major question in terms of U.S. domestic politics is how big is the oil shock? How long will the oil shock last? That's going to determine, I think, how big a liability this becomes for Trump. Now, people who have been looking at this in terms of, is it going to develop into Iraq? I think you have to bear in mind that there have been no boots on the ground, large-scale occupying invasion force deployments. There may be special forces teams that are used on occasions. There may be people from other countries on the ground that are deployed in Iranian territory. There's talk about the Kurds. There's talk about the Afghan Taliban. There's talk about Turkey, because Turkey was hit by an Iranian missile, whether Turkey will get involved either directly or through Azerbaijan. There's all kinds of things that might potentially happen in terms of other people's ground forces. But there's been no real serious talk of U.S. deployment. Now, of course, the United States doesn't formally rule out deploying troops, but in practice, the Trump administration knows that these initial strikes are not overwhelmingly popular, and if ground forces are deployed, the popularity of this will completely crater, because then it will seem to be like Iraq, and Iran is a much more expensive and difficult to invade country than Iraq because of its topography. It's an extremely mountainous country. It is much slower going than crossing the deserts, the open terrain of Iraq, or you say Libya or Ukraine. These are much more open countries than Iran. Iran is mountainous. Iran is difficult. The Zagros Mountains are a pain in the neck to transport a ground army through. So I don't think there's going to be any kind of American large-scale troop deployment. What you might see are different armies or different forces in the vicinity being used to try to put further pressure on the Iranian state to cause further stability problems in Iran. And that's what I think the goal of the operation is from the American point of view. The Americans want to create a power vacuum in Iran. They want to open up space, and then they want to see what fills that space. So a lot of people have the view that when you do regime change, you ought to have in mind who you want in charge, and that the goal of your operation should be to put a particular person or a particular force in charge of the country. And so when the Trump administration is asked about its endgame, about its plan, a lot of the questions revolve around who's going to end up in charge. And the administration has no answer to that question, because the administration has decided that its aim is not to put anyone in particular in charge, but to open up a vacuum, see what fills it, and if anything fills it that the administration doesn't like, keep the vacuum open until something fills it that the administration can accept. Now, the risk in doing something like that is that you create a situation where no one is able to fill the vacuum. And lots of different people attempt partially to fill it, begin fighting with each other, and you get civil conflict, failed state, large-scale impoverishing of the country. And this would describe roughly what happened in Libya when the Obama administration intervened from the sky, targeted Gaddafi's ground troops, killed Gaddafi. When the United States got involved in Libya, it created a power vacuum in Libya. And then that power vacuum was not filled by any one actor. It was filled by lots of different distinct players who then got into a prolonged fight with each other that's still going on, with many different countries getting involved in Libyan politics and supplying the various armies. The major forces are the technically elected government in Tripoli that has power on the basis of an election that occurred in 2014. I don't think there's been an election in Libya since 2014. And then General Haftar, who used to be one of Gaddafi's generals, then after the war with Chad was disgraced, went to the United States, became a U.S. citizen, then came back to Libya during the overthrow of Gaddafi, became the major general in the army looking to overthrow Gaddafi, and then took over running things in the eastern part of Libya, and has been positioning his son, Saddam Haftar, who's named after Saddam Hussein, to potentially succeed him when he dies. He's 82 years old, and he is reported to have had a stroke a few years ago, so his health is touch and go. But he's trying to put his son, Saddam, in position to be his successor. And at this point, Haftar controls a large part of Libya, not just the eastern part. He's got a significant part of the rural desert western part too. And he almost took Tripoli back in 2020, but he was repulsed by the Turks, who sent an army to Tripoli to stop Haftar from taking over. And this is because the Turks perceived Haftar to be a partner of the Egyptians. And the Egyptians and the Turks have had a bad relationship ever since Morsi was overthrown in the coup by Sisi. Morsi is someone that Erdogan considered his friend and ally because they're both Muslim Brotherhood adjacent figures. But Sisi, since Sisi overthrew Morsi, has for a long time not gotten along with Erdogan, and therefore in Libyan politics, the Haftar has been buddied up with the Egyptians, and the democratic government in Tripoli has been buddied up with the Turks. This may be changing now, though, because Egypt and Turkey are starting to have a rapprochement because they're, at this point, that conflict is 10 years old and there are common interests in the region, and maybe they can find a way to resolve the dispute in Libya. Anyway, all of this is a bit of a side thing to just make the point that in Iran, it's possible that the power vacuum could not be filled by one particular force, but could become a big open field in which a great big disaster happens. But if that great big disaster happens, I don't think it will involve U.S. deployment to Iranian territory. Rather, it will look like Libya. It will be this big disaster that's going on that you're not paying attention to. Just as probably most of you don't know about Saddam Haftar and don't know about what's been going on in Libya, you probably won't know if it turns into a big disaster in Iran, what's going on there in 10 years' time. It will probably just become a permanent disaster that sits in the background while we do other things. Now, I don't think that's the goal of the Trump administration. I don't think they want a permanent disaster. What they want is for the power vacuum to be filled by somebody that they can accept. And so they want to create enough instability that there's a vacuum, that somebody can fill it who otherwise wouldn't have been able to fill it, but not such a big vacuum that it produces spiraling violence that causes instability, not just in Iran, but in the region. Bear in mind, when everything went to hell in Libya, it didn't just go to hell in Libya. It went to hell in all of the countries around Libya, because all of the mercenaries in Africa who came to Libya to participate in the Libyan conflict, during any lull in that conflict, those mercenaries go looking for something to do in Chad and in Niger and in Mauritania and in Mali and in Nigeria. And they get involved in what's going on in all of those countries. And then you have rebel groups, raider groups roving around in the rural parts of all of those countries. You've got the oil sector in Nigeria dealing with roving bands of people who are attacking oil installations. It causes a lot of trouble when you have one of these things pop off, because all the states nearby end up in some way, shape, or form getting dragged into it. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a U.S. ground troop deployment, because there hasn't been a large-scale U.S. ground troop deployment in any of those African countries I've just mentioned. The French briefly got involved in Mali at one stage after the Libyan civil war, but that involvement didn't become a major point of discussion, wasn't in the news all the time, and eventually wrapped up. So I think that there's a lot of ways that this could go where it eventually is not that big an issue, but also doesn't get resolved and becomes a long-term permanent problem. And I think a lot of people handwave about this and go, oh, World War III is what you ought to be worried about. Something like a Iraq situation is what you've got to be worried about. But implicitly, when people say World War III or they say Iraq, they're saying it's okay if it turns out like Libya, because who cares about stuff like that? We don't pay attention to stuff like that. And meanwhile, Libya's per capita GDP was cut in half by that intervention by Obama. That country was completely destroyed. That country's in worse shape than Iraq. That country's in a condition that is similar to that of Syria. And it got almost no media attention. Nobody cared. Nobody's been doing anything about it. So that's what I think is, one possible disaster outcome. So what would be short of that? What would be short of that would be the government in Iran could very quickly pick and rally around a replacement supreme leader and then try to carry on. But if they pick somebody that the Trump administration doesn't like, and the Trump administration has intelligence that allows it to target particular people, then the Trump administration may respond to anyone who fills the vacuum that it doesn't like with more strikes to eliminate those people. So I don't think that the Iranian regime can simply pick somebody and try to carry on as before. That then raises a question of, is the Iranian regime able to agree on somebody who would change the policy in such a way that the Americans would declare victory and back off? Or is there going to be infighting about what to do, or further rounds of violence where the Iranian regime tries to pick people and the Americans target the people who are picked? And then you've got, what are the other parts of the Iranian state that could try to do something outside the typical process? So instead of the Council of Experts picking a new supreme leader, what else could happen? Could you have a coup by the Republican Guard? Could you have the civilian leadership try to take a larger role? The president is now on the interim council. Could the interim council try to maintain power and operate independently of the Council of Experts? Could there be something going on in the non-state sector, the protest elements within Iranian society? How well organized are those? Are there any leaders in those areas who could emerge? Could there be some cooperative thing between those people and elements of the Republican Guard? This becomes ways in which it could end that would fall short of a total unstable civil conflict, failed state disaster. Of course, some think that eventually Trump will be forced to back off because of the War Powers Resolution. The thing about that is that the War Powers Resolution, first, the Senate declined to revise the legislation to stop Trump. So the Senate could have made a legal intervention to prohibit Trump from continuing to carry on with these strikes. And that attempt to get through the Senate an intervention failed on a party line vote, with only one Democratic senator, Fetterman, flipping, and only one Republican senator, Rand Paul, flipping. So it seems like the Republican Party is going to back Trump in this, at least at the congressional level, for some period of time. Now, the War Powers Resolution still says that you would need to have positive congressional support for a deployment that lasts for more than 60 days, so for more than 2 months. The argument that the Trump administration will make is that they're not deploying because they're not sending ground troops into Iran. And this is why the lack of ground troops is a very important part of the Trump administration being credibly committed to maybe 3 or 4 months, or maybe as late as September. I've heard different dates for how long they think they might go. To be credibly committed to that, they have to have an argument that they're not going to deploy ground troops, and that what they're going to do is going to be airstrikes. It's going to be planes, it's going to be drones, it's going to be other missiles and other kinds of things that don't constitute a deployment in the view of the War Powers Resolution from the 70s. And an originalist interpretation of the War Powers Resolution from the 70s might very well align with that, because back in the 70s, it was very difficult to have a large-scale air campaign that doesn't have any ground forces involved. If you think about the 20th century, if you want to do airstrikes in the 20th century, how do you do it? If it's World War II, how do you call it an airstrike? You got a guy, like a ranger, and he has a radio, and he goes, "Hey, I need you to drop some bombs at these coordinates." And then some planes come, and the planes drop a bunch of these stupid bombs, and the stupid bombs blow up in the general vicinity of the coordinates that the person gave, and the plane hopes that it kills whatever it is that the ranger saw. At this point, what they're doing is they've got satellite imagery, they've got hacked technology. They are getting access to people's phones and laptops so that they can track them or listen to them through their devices. And then they are throwing the precision weapons that they have been manufacturing and designing over the course of the last 30, 40 years at those quite specific locations. So you don't need somebody on the ground necessarily to say, here's where it goes. Now, everyone will point out, and rightly so, that these weapons still cause civilian casualties. They still cause collateral damage. You can still have the wrong location or the wrong address. You can hit a school. You can kill large numbers of civilians still with these precision weapons. But if you compare this to a bunch of B-52s dropping a bunch of dumb bombs over Dresden in the middle of the night, it is qualitatively different from that. And what it allows you to go after specific people that previously you would never have been able to feel that you were likely to get with a bombing run. A 20th century bombing run would not get you the Ayatollah. You can only get the Ayatollah because of this advanced intelligence that comes from information technology, and because of these advanced weapons that allow you to target with a significant level of precision those locations. And this has produced a new kind of warfare in which the leadership is the target. You don't have to capture the capital city and apprehend the leader. You know, in World War II, if the Nazis want to get Stalin, they have to go to Moscow, and then Stalin has to be there, and then they have to arrest him. And he has an opportunity to leave and get out of Moscow and go somewhere else. And if the Nazis want to get Stalin, they have to follow Stalin where he goes. He's like the king of Persia. You know, when Alexander the Great is invading the Persian Empire and he has to capture the Persian king, you know, he's got to follow the Persian king into Persian territory as the Persian king runs away from him. And he has to actually chase him. And this is part of what leads Alexander the Great to India. He's chasing the king of Persia deeper and deeper into Persian territory. To a very significant degree, even into the mid to late 20th century, warfare still had this quality. When in 1989, the United States apprehended Noriega, they had to invade the country, physically invade it, and it took them a month to get to where Noriega is and then drive him into leaving the Vatican embassy where he was holed up. He was hiding in the Vatican embassy, and they had to play loud music at him to sleep deprive him and get him to give up. And then he eventually leaves the Vatican embassy and they apprehend him. It still took them several weeks to get Noriega because they had to physically go and find him and get him with an army. So this possibility of getting leadership people with precision weapons on the basis of information technology intelligence has significantly changed the logic of this and produced new arguments about what's possible that have to be proven or disproven. And so when people start pointing to the history of air power or the history of 20th century regime change, the people who are making these decisions are not sensitive to those arguments because they think they have more advanced intelligence and more advanced weapons that allow them to do things they couldn't do before. And to a certain degree, they are right. They do have new technology that allows them to do things they couldn't do before. But there's a question about whether this new technology allows them to do the things they think they can do. They think they can not only kill the Ayatollah, but that they can open up a power vacuum and sustain it and use the power vacuum that they're opening up to dictate who takes control of the country. And that's a very ambitious claim, to not just be able to take out the leader, but to use the threat of continuing to take out leaders to determine who is able ultimately to run the country.
Without ground troops.
Without ground troops and without creating too big a vacuum to the point at which no one can run the country and the whole thing falls apart. That's a very tricky thing to try to do. It's very risky, and it's based on new technology and theories about what new technology permits or allows. And a lot of the time when people talk about warfare, they want to talk about warfare on the basis of historical analogies. But the people who always get completely flummoxed in war are the people who think that the war has to work like wars that they know about from the past. You know, the worst American Civil War commander is somebody who thinks it has to work like the Mexican-American War. You know, the worst Crimean War commander is someone who thinks it's got to work like the Napoleonic War. It's the people who can see what new technology allows you to do that couldn't be done before who potentially make major breakthroughs in military competition. So they're going to have all of these technological and intelligence-based arguments for what they're doing. And when leftists start talking about Cold War regime change, it's not going to be persuasive. And then you also have to bear in mind that if you're just talking about it from the level of the Western states getting what they want, there were a lot of Cold War regime changes in which Western states got what they wanted for a finite period of time with long-term instability risk. You know, when the French went into the car in 1979, I think it was, to get the Emperor Bokassa, they got him with the Air Force and a paratrooper regiment. They just came down into the capital of the car. They get Bokassa, they whisk him away, and then they were able to get the pro-French guy in charge of the car. 2 years later, he's couped out, but then they get another pro-French person in charge of the car for about 10 years after it, 10, 12 years after that. From the point of view of the French, they succeeded in doing regime change in the car with the Air Force and a paratrooper regiment in 1979 with relatively primitive technology. So this is the kind of way of thinking that is guiding a lot of this. People look at those kinds of interventions and these kinds of decapitation strategies and say, well, with this new technology, what could this potentially allow you to do? And because you can't prove that it can't work, because it's not been tried this way with this stuff, you can't prove that it can't work. It becomes a question of what level of risk you're willing to tolerate and what your attitude is to gambling. And people go, how can anybody gamble with lives in war? War is always gambling because no one ever knows in war what is going to happen. War is never a sure thing. You can run as many simulations and war games as you like. It's a completely different thing once people start getting blown up. So this is why it's become a very difficult argument for people to even participate in, because the fundamentals for how this works are not agreed upon. It's being litigated at the level of force.
Yes, there's a lot of things there to address. I kept them in my mind so I won't forget them. But the first thing regarding the precision strikes, I mean, that's obviously a big factor, because a big thing that people have, pointed out is that there's never been a successful regime change through air power alone. It's only required, it's required some level of ground invasion. And that's, what like a lot of people keep saying. There's this prof, I don't know if you've seen him go viral, Professor Jiang. I think he's kind of quite viral. He's this like Chinese professor who, sort of like he has this reputation for predicting a lot of things, and he's gotten quite popular. And his whole thing is like, yeah, like this is not going to work unless they do a ground invasion. The precision airstrikes, of course, like the fact is the Israelis at least have demonstrated that they can target people very easily if they want to, which is all the more reason for the kind of proof of their genocide. The fact that when they blow up these hospitals and blow up so many civilians in Gaza, you can't call that like accidental, because they clearly
The
have the
argument that they
power
would
to
make
target
is that
them.
those specific individuals that they're targeting hide in buildings that are
Right.
full of civilians, such that even with precision weapons, you nonetheless will kill large numbers of civilians. That's how they try to defend it.
Right. Which we know is still insidious. And still, I mean, sometimes they'll just, bomb like areas that don't even have, those particular areas. But, at this point, this is kind of stating the obvious. To the more stuff about Iran that you're saying. So I think the big thing that complicates this is that there is different expectations among different groups and different interests among different groups in this whole conflict. For starters, I mean, there's different potential objectives for the Americans, there's different objectives for the Israelis, and there's different objectives for the Iranians, and then different objectives for the Iranian diaspora, who people tend to think represents the Iranians. And this is, I think, very crucial to highlight, because the diaspora, I mean, the Iranian diaspora has a tendency that you've seen a lot of diasporas that kind of flee very terrible despotic regimes, but it's particularly interesting in the sense that leading up to this conflict, there are these huge protests in the US, like in LA, and in Canada, there's huge ones in Toronto and Vancouver. Just huge, like this, like Iranians with the monarchist flags, celebrating Trump and the Israelis bombing the country. If you point out to them at all about, maybe not to trust the intentions of the Israelis or the Americans, they'll say something about how the Persian Empire and the Jews have a long relationship and protecting each other, and how somehow this is anything. I'm telling you, this is a real talking point. I've heard it like verbatim repeated by like people in the Iranian diaspora. And
Expats,
the other
man.
big thing, yeah, the big thing is the narrative that I see coming out of the diaspora is that there's an expectation that the Shah's son will be installed as the next leader. And this is
That's
what a
not
lot of
gonna
people have been predicting. And Trump, just like yesterday, at the time that this is being recording, was asked as to whether, the Shah's son will be transitionary leader, which is what, the Shah's son himself had purported wanting to do. He said that he could be a transitionatory leader. Trump said he's a very great person, but we're not looking at him at the moment. We're looking at someone within the regime capable of taking power. We'll see. Preferably someone who is more popular.
I think he said
That's
in the country rather than in the regime.
right. But more
Yeah.
popular. And it's not him,
Yeah.
which already kind of crushes the whole expectation that I've been seeing, which is like you're going to get the Shah back, and all these diaspora making these AI generated reels of like how Iran will look like under the Shah's son. It's
Expats.
really this huge disconnect.
Yeah, expats are loud because expats live in Western countries, speak Western languages, are always easy and readily available for interviews. You don't have to go to a dangerous place where you might be suspected of being a spy to talk to an expat. So it's easy for journalists to interview expats. Expats also have less at stake in the country than the people who live there because they're personally safe. Many of them have families back home, but they're personally safe. And many of the people who are closest to them and their family don't live in the country. That's an important factor. And part of the, when you're not in a country, you don't have as much at stake. And so it's less disciplining for the way that you think about it and the way you feel. If you have romantic feelings about wanting it to be a particular way, it's abstract. So those romantic feelings are going to be more dominant in an expat population. Interventions that are done on the basis of expat opinion or expat intelligence tend to not go well because the expat opinion does not typically correspond with the people in the country. There's a reason that somebody's an expat, which is that they fit too badly with the regime to stay in the country. They had to leave because of how out of sync they were with the regime. Almost by definition, people who flee a regime are the least compatible with that regime of anybody in the country. So you can't really use expat opinion to try to have a sense for what opinion is inside Iran. That said, we know that there were significant protests in Iran, and we know that some number of thousands of protesters were arrested. We don't know how many thousand. People have thrown different numbers around depending on how big they think the protests were or how big they want them to have been. But we know that at least some number of thousands of protesters were recently arrested, and that has happened on several occasions over the years. There's a significant amount of unrest that has been kicked up within Iran. Now, whether the people who are part of those protests think like the expats in London or New York, I don't know about that, but they have discontent. Now, are they well organized enough to be able to use a power vacuum to make a move that is effective? Are they going to be able to get some part of the Iranian army to defect to them and help them take the state? That's a big question. And to know the answer to that question, you have to know the conditions inside Iran better than I think anybody who lives in the West possibly can, probably better than anyone who lives in Iran can, because in Iran, it's not a free society where you can openly oppose the state. So the degree to which there's opposition to the state is probably not known even within Iranian society. There's a question probably, if I were an Iranian political scientist who had studied Iran for years and years, I wouldn't know for sure what could happen. I might have theories. I might say, here's what I think, but I couldn't know for sure because when you have a society that's under a great deal of authoritarian repression, you just don't know what people are thinking and feeling because they're not free to express it.
Yeah, there's been some studies that tried to look at like VPN, users and people who kind of get around the system, which itself is kind of selecting a kind of biased sample size.
Yeah, it
right?
always
But
selects for people who
yeah,
are willing to give a sign of their opposition. And
yeah,
the people who are not willing to give a sign of their opposition, that's the category of people that you really need to know what they think.
right.
And you
that's the
always have that
problem is,
information too late.
and that's the problem is those people don't necessarily support the regime or oppose it, but they might just be afraid to say their opinion because of the conditions. And from what it just seems, given the protests and the sign of how the regime reacts to protests, I don't think the regime has a lot of legitimacy aside from the people who it really depend on the most, which is that's kind of what makes Iran very stubborn and hard to overthrow, which is its elite. Its elite is deeply entrenched into the economy and politics. Like they have some have called it like a mixture of a clerical militocracy with, oligarchic elements in the sense that the military elite is connected to the economy. It's a lot like Egypt in this regard, except, it's even more complicated because there's even more divisions. But the issue is that like the ruling elite have a stake in maintaining that regime. And the people who have the guns, because this is not like a country armed by a civilian army like Vietnam, for example, where in the case of Vietnam being invaded, Vietnamese citizens fought against the Americans. It was very hard to fight against. And also like hard to topple for that reason. The Iranian system is hard to topple, but it's also, weaker in a sense because it relies on this professional army, right? And within that, there's like multiple branches. But the real like army with the infrastructure, with the resources, with the power is the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, of course. And, they have a religious faith, that is heavily emphasizes martyrdom, right? They have regardless of how many people there believe in it, is really irrelevant because a lot of them have the interest to believe in it, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of what makes it a very different thing than the Venezuelan case. That's one big factor. But the thing is, I think that from what it seems to me is like at the level of population, there is like an all-time lack of support for the regime. But the big problem is that there is no real unity as to what comes after.
Right.
And that's where the monarchists are very out of step. Because the monarchists think that like just because of this protest that you can have like the Shah's son, I mean, that would, like it's very delusional in so many ways just because like part of the whole basis of the Iranian Revolution in the first place is literally against the kind of, nepotism and lack of meritocracy that old regime represented and, the colonial aspects of it. So it's just very delusional and it's difficult to talk about because, when it comes to also the Iranian and the Israeli and American interests, I think that's where what interests me too is because, ostensibly America does have an interest in not letting this become a Libya situation, right? There is an interest in even potentially having a state that is not as powerful to like countervail American power, but is also gives a reason, to keep arming the Gulf states. They have a little bit of different interest in Israel, which is to dominate the region. Israel, in my view, I just don't see any incentive Israel has whatsoever in allowing for a strong or democratic state in Iran, unless it's a very weak democratic state, with like Iraq, like how Iraq currently is, which is kind of very weak, divided democratic state that doesn't really have capacity. Because Israel, what did it do as soon as the regime was changed in Syria, with Assad being toppled? They went and bombed all of their essentially military facilities, like their jets, their tanks, and their arms. Like, so they just wanted to, cripple any kind of opposition to their utter dominance. So, like the Israelis, I mean, what incentive is there to even have a democratic Iran or a strong Iran? I
don't think anybody
see
cares about a democratic Iran. I don't think anybody who's intervening, apart from people who live in the country, I think there are Iranians who care about a democratic Iran.
And the neocons claim to care about democratic Iran.
The Trump administration clearly doesn't care about democratic Iran because democratic Iran is not going to be brought about by creating a power vacuum. Certainly, you're not going to ensure that. If it happens, it's an outside shot kind of thing. I think they're really looking for a Haftar. They're looking for somebody in the Iranian military who can emerge, who's able to provide a certain level of stability, but also can be positioned as still possessing some antagonistic qualities. Because Iran has driven over the years many Arab states into friendlier relationships with Israel. And if Iran becomes something completely tame, it would be harder to continue to use it as a specter to get the Arab states to cooperate with Israel. So I do think that there's some likelihood that we'll have an authoritarian dictator in Iran that Arab states still don't feel totally great about.
Well, there's a lot of factors, like it's not even there's also what would be rational in their interest, but doesn't necessarily have to go that way. There could be, because that rationality is also prediction. So what they predict within the regime could be different from what the Americans want or predict, in the sense that if the IRGC really thinks that this is its time, that if it's do or die, it might very well allow its successor to be an even more radical force. And if they really feel like it is their time, and that they believe that the only way to prevent the fall of the regime is to show Israel and America that there's consequence to these attacks, they might go for an unprecedented escalation, like inflicting like a bigger amount of U.S. and Israeli casualties than
I don't
before,
know that
especially
they have the
right now.
military capability to do that. And I think that they probably know that they don't have the military capability to do
Well, they
that.
claim, as of the time we're saying now, that they sunk a U.S. warship.
Oh, yes, but they claim all kinds of wild things. Remember during the 12-Day War when they posted those cryptic tweets about how something big was coming and then nothing happened? They grunt a lot, especially with their social media, about their capability. But they are not stupid. They know what the limitations of the capability is, which is why they immediately start looking to find off-ramps whenever this stuff gets going. They know that it's a very dangerous situation for them.
Mhm.
They think about things like nuclear weapons because they know this is a situation that can greatly endanger them. They know that at the conventional level, they aren't going to win a fight with the United States. They know that. Gaddafi knew it. Gaddafi, one of the things that he said shortly before he was killed by the United States is that if the Iranians get isolated and don't have anyone come to help them in a situation like this, that regime is not going to be able to deal with the United States. Now, I think when Gaddafi said that, he was imagining perhaps American occupying forces being involved in a regime change. But even so, the Iranian military is not going to be able to have a long-term slugfest with the United States and Israel. And we've also heard that the Chinese are not going to get involved, which makes sense. And neither will the Russians. The Russians and the Chinese don't have any particularly strong love for the Iranian regime. You got to remember
Well,
that
the Chinese have
Russians
lots of
have dealt with,
investments.
they've dealt with problems in terms of radical Islam in Chechnya, and the Chinese with the Uyghurs in Western China. They have their set of issues with political Islam.
Yeah, but those are like Sunni Wahhabi Islam problems, whereas the
Yes.
Iranian regime's antagonistic to those kind of Wahhabist elements, if anything.
It is, but it also
Which is
advances
precisely why the
a theocratic kind of idea that does conflict with the way in which the Russians and the Chinese do politics. I would be really shocked if there was serious military help for Iran coming from either Russia or China at any stage.
Well, Russia
Also, the Russians don't have much available at this stage.
Yeah, I was about to say, well, the Russians just, as the time we're recording, kind of seems to be willing to compromise on a deal with the U.S. on Ukraine and scale things back. Like, so who knows where that will lead, but they seem to be suddenly more willing to, compromise with the U.S., which is interesting. Maybe there's something their intelligence knows, or something about the event that changed it, about who they could target. I'm not sure. But with China, they have a lot of investments, but it's not their style, I think, in terms of just how they operate geopolitically, to really get involved in arming another country in a war. Like, I don't really, and it's not because it's not their sphere of influence. Their influence with Iran is just business deals. Like, they have huge investments in their economy, which could ostensibly continue, actually.
Those business deals are not threatened
yeah.
by this because Chinese participation in the global economic system is itself guaranteed by the United States. It was explicitly permitted and invited by the United States and continues to be permitted and invited by the American Blue Water Navy, which has made the waters completely safe for Chinese exports for many decades now. Yeah. People who frame the United States and China as antagonistic, as if they were the Soviet Union and the United States in the 70s, miss that China's growth has happened with the cooperation of the United States. And when the United States and China get in a trade war, they are wrestling over the terms of that cooperation. But it's not at all obvious that that will result, certainly within any short or medium term unit of time, in the termination of that cooperation. A disagreement about the terms doesn't necessarily mean that that cooperation is going to simply end. It might be gradually unwound. There might be decoupling, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be, a switch being flipped and all of a sudden China's leading some second world system. And there's a lot of fantasy thinking on the left about this because there's lots of people on the left that are nostalgic for the Cold War or miss a time when there was a clear alternative to the American dominated system. But when China came into the WTO, when it came into international financial institutions, it became part of that system. And it can't simply withdraw from that system. And if it gets involved in some sort of military conflict with the United States, that would endanger its continued participation in the system. That's not to say that China would be devastated by being kicked out of the system. China exiting the system or having its global trade disrupted would be disruptive not just for China, but also for the United States and many other trade partners around the world. But Iran is not something that China is going to risk all of that stuff over. China has much more to gain by continuing to participate in the system of international trade.
So yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up before was the ground troops thing, because you seem confident that they will not. And I mean, it makes sense why Trump won't want to bring ground troops, because he has campaigned on being the anti-war president, not being a George Bush. And he would want to win the midterms that are coming up. So why would he want to do something so unpopular like send ground troops? But that's, on the one hand, this is kind of what makes this whole thing even worse. Like, being like Libya, in my opinion, is a lot worse than Iraq. I mean, in terms of just the outcomes of those two countries, like, what you got is like the worst thing that came out of Iraq was really ISIL. And that was due to a big thing that could have been prevented, which is how they dealt with the military personnel of the Ba'athist regime after the fact. But what Iraq is now is kind of a corrupt, sort of weak, semi-democratic state from highly influenced by different countries at once, and it's quite divided. But it's like a state where people can live. Libya is a much more different case, and without ground troops, that almost makes things worse for all the Persians who desperately were saying, please, Trump, Israel, free my country, give my country freedom. Well, it's like just kind of bombing and hoping for a power vacuum to be seized is almost riskier in that. Way riskier. But there's, I think, a counterpoint as to whether Trump will send ground troops, which is this other argument I've heard from liberals, which is that Trump might want to use war powers that could be granted to him in the event that this escalates more and that he sends in ground troops, which could potentially give him the authority to postpone the elections. And I mean,
it's not constitutional. In the United States, we had elections during the American Civil War, during World War II. You don't postpone elections in the United States. It doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter. You can't postpone the elections because they're enshrined in the Constitution. And it's 2026. It is the anniversary, it's a big anniversary for 1776. There are going to be elections. Bill Clinton has said that there are going to be elections. There are going to be elections. He's not going to postpone or cancel the elections. That can't be done in the American political system. You can't sustain political legitimacy in the United States if you try to cancel the elections. It won't happen. If he tries to do it, he'll be removed in a military coup. He'll be impeached and removed either by Congress or directly by the military if he tries to do that. Will not happen. They will not attempt it. They are not seriously considering it. No, not going to happen. The administration regards the Iraq War as a particularly stupid thing. Trump specifically thinks that the Iraq War was a very stupid thing. And they think it's stupid because it involved a long-term ground troop deployment. Long-term ground troop deployment is politically unpopular, and it's incredibly financially expensive. It's incredibly expensive to do. So if you look at Iraq from Trump's point of view, this is a way to burn an enormous pile of money to accomplish very little. Very little, because as you say, the current Iraq administration is not even influenced principally by the United States, but by a lot of different countries that have different interests and stakes within Iraqi territory.
We didn't even get the oil. We didn't even get out the oil.
And we all remember what he said to Jeb Bush in the debate about George W. Bush and the times he called for the impeachment of George W. Bush because he considered the war to be extremely stupid. Also, just look at the behavior of the United States in international politics under both Democrats and Republicans, the first Trump administration and Obama and Biden since Iraq. What does the United States typically do? It intervenes from the sky. It uses special forces teams, sometimes very small numbers of troops in limited circumstances to try to achieve its aims. It does not do great big deployments. It does not do great big invasions. The principle of Vietnamization. Arm other people, make other people be the ground troops. That is the paradigm that has become dominant for both Democrats and Republicans in the United States. And why is that?
Well, except Iraq and Afghanistan, of course.
Well, yes, since Iraq and Afghanistan, that's my point. Iraq and Afghanistan was an exception to this general principle of trying to do more and more from the sky with minimal troop presence. And if you've got to use troops, try to use other people's troops whenever you can. Because the quickest way to make a foreign policy issue actually matter in American politics is to deploy ground troops, because then you have ordinary Americans who are losing family members. When you don't deploy American ground troops, then Americans who have a direct stake in the conflict is greatly reduced, except insofar as there are consequences for things like the oil price. So it becomes an economic issue and loses its foreign policy character. So this war will only be a serious foreign policy issue in the midterms if there's a troop deployment or if this activity is still going on when the midterm elections take place at this kind of level. But the overwhelming likelihood is that they will try to find some way or some excuse to end it some months before the midterm elections take place so that they can claim that they quickly solved the problem, because they do not want anything like ground troops in Iran during those midterm elections. But I understand that there are some people who are just convinced that there aren't going to be competitive multi-party elections in the United States anymore because Trump is somehow going to cancel the elections. There are people who believe this. And I've staked my entire reputation and career on this not being the case. I've said it's an embedded democracy where you can't avoid competitive multi-party elections. And the people who don't get this about the United States fundamentally don't understand the kind of regime that exists, the kind of political culture that exists at this stage. They just don't get it. They are making analogies with other regimes from other times and places in radically different circumstances where you don't have a regime that's been around for over 2 centuries, where there's nothing that binds the people together apart from their commitment to the political system. There's no common shared culture, no common shared sources of national identity apart from this loose commitment to the political system. You have a political system that's outlasted imperial regimes, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. And so people think that this political system has a mystique because it has outlasted these competitors. They think that people who talk about other ways of trying to run the government aren't serious, are meme characters. They're not taken seriously by the bulk of the American public. And while the American public feels that the democracy doesn't work and recognizes all sorts of problems with the democracy, that doesn't mean a positive commitment to something else. And
Yeah.
if I'm wrong about that, you can never read anything I've written again. If there's no election at the end of this year, I will quit the internet and I will not post for a long time if there's no midterm election in 2026. I don't entertain this as a serious possibility.
To play devil's advocate, it's a different argument to say there won't be an election, and then it's another argument to say they might try to postpone elections or to change the rules, kind of like how they currently are trying to change the rules when it comes to
You can't change
voter
that.
IDs.
Yeah,
well, like
the voter
needing your
ID is a different
passport,
thing.
putting
That's
your
something that's been argued about for years in American politics.
But wait, the reason why I don't think they could postpone elections is ironically because of all the people who are warning about him trying to, in the sense that I don't think it would work because of the way in which the American regime is legitimated. But that's also because of this sort of reaction, in some sense, I kind of like the fear about democracy, it makes sense, even though I wish it was applied to other presidents who increased the, executive branch and not just Donald Trump. But it's not. The reason why I think it's not like a crazy fear to think that they might try to do something using foreign policy is because, many people who are connected to Trump have quite explicitly said that they want him to run a third term. Like Steve Bannon, has openly said when interviewed by The Economist about how, they're already working on ways in which Trump can get around the Constitution.
And it's constitutionally not permitted. He can't get around the Constitution, and he's too old to do it anyway. He's too old to even plausibly try to do it. It's not possible. And people talk up what these people like Bannon at this point has been on the fringe of the MAGA space for a long time. He's not in the administration. He's not at this point a close advisor of the president. They take things that he says and act as if this is really what's going to happen or what they're going to do. And people take all sorts of things people say. There's a difference between what people say and what you can actually do while sustaining political legitimacy. This kind of stuff can't be legitimated. It will produce, if someone were to attempt it, catastrophic consequences for that person.
Well, yeah, that's what the debate is more about. I think the more interesting debate is to whether they'll try.
They won't even try. They may try to legally contest various things that happen, like they did after 2020. They may try to challenge in the courts various things that take place. But then if the Supreme Court makes a ruling, they'll grouse about it and ultimately abide by it. Like they just did with the tariffs. He goes, okay, I can't do the tariffs through that authority. I have to do the tariffs through some alternative authority. He'll yell and scream about it. The Supreme Court justices are all idiots and they're all stupid. But he doesn't regard himself as not being bound by the constitutional law.
But I still don't really see that, though. I think Trump doesn't care about the Constitution. And the only reason why he was okay with the Supreme Court blocking his tariffs is because he probably knows that the tariffs would increase inflation and that could backfire on his midterm prospects.
I'm not saying
it's like almost like an excuse. It's almost an excuse at this point to say, oh, the Supreme Court blocked it. So he doesn't actually have to do something that he said he was going to do.
That he cares about the Constitution. I'm saying that he is in fact bound by it and recognizes that he's bound by it. He might want to be emperor of the planet, but he recognizes that he's bound by the Constitution in practice, and that if he disregards Supreme Court rulings, he's not going to stick around.
Yeah, but there's been various ways in which presidents have, overreached their authority beyond the Constitution. I mean,
yeah,
to big extent, the Patriot Act is like one of those big moves.
Yeah, but that's at the level of opinion. The Supreme Court said that the Patriot Act was fine. So from the point of view of the legal system, this stuff which is regarded by the left as an overreach from the point of view of morality or from the point of view of people's values, legally in the United States has continued to be backed by the various institutions of the Constitution. So you could say that the Constitution has violated Kantian moral law, if you'd like. But
what's to say that the Constitution won't, that the Supreme Court won't potentially, depending on, let's say, if there's like a lot of American casualties in a certain instance, that they could grant him more powers to, let's say, postpone the election.
They can't grant him powers to postpone the election. Congress cannot pass a law which postpones American elections. That would be found unconstitutional, certainly by the court. If Congress would never vote to do that, in part because the legitimacy of the members of Congress themselves comes from being up for election. If Congress takes away its own electoral legitimation, then Congress is put in a position of total impotence.
I don't think that's likely. But if the president could postpone congressional elections,
executive order away the congressional elections. The members of Congress would impeach somebody who did that. The Supreme Court would strike down it. If he tried to defy the Supreme Court, Congress would impeach him on the basis of the defiance. And if Congress, for some reason, didn't impeach him on the basis of the defiance, there would be real questions about the loyalty of the armed forces in the country. The thing that really sets the United States apart is that the Army and the intelligence services are more loyal to the Constitution than they are to the president, their understanding or interpretation of the Constitution. Generally speaking, they'll defer to the Supreme Court to decide what the Constitution means.
About the armed forces, definitely not the intelligence agencies.
Within the United States. Now, in terms of foreign countries, they're just looking to advance U.S. interests abroad. Yeah. But in terms of the United States, the CIA, they wouldn't accept certain kinds of socialists out there, lefties running the country. But within the framework of what is going on in the United States today, the CIA is going to want there to be competitive multi-party elections. The FBI, all of the intelligence services, the NSA, et cetera, they all want competitive multi-party elections in 2026. It's extremely risky to everybody in the American state to not have competitive multi-party elections in 2026. It would dramatically elevate. And look at how he backed off with the whole Greenland thing, just over a run on bonds, right? Just on a run on the currency a little bit, You get a little bit of a reaction from the financial markets, and he backed off the Greenland thing. Can you imagine the reaction of financial markets to an attempt to not have the 2026 midterms? Everybody who knows anything and has any level of financial resources expects the 2026 midterm elections to take place. If you were to actually make some kind of move on that front, it would be economically devastating. It can't be sustained. The president can't act without any concern for political legitimacy. He can't do it. And people who think like this, I don't know what to tell you. They don't get how politics works. They just don't get it.
Well, let's say, why do they think this, right? And I've said before that part of why Trump is seen as a major exception to other presidencies at the level of undemocratic developments is due to his decorum, right? And his sort of style, which they really don't like.
What does that
they really
have
don't like
to do
style,
with what you can legitimate?
Right, but that's why you have all these liberals who say, like, now is the end of democracy. George Bush was fine, but Trump, that's a step too far. But I think there's another factor. There's one other factor, and I think this is, I wouldn't say like really that decisive now, but I think what has raised concerns is that for the first time in a long time in America now, really maybe arguably since the Civil War, maybe there's been since then, a sort of faction of the elite who is overtly opposed to democracy. I would say there's still a very fringe part of that elite, but you could look at
way
Peter
overrepresented in the liberal press.
Sure. Yeah, they exist, right? And you didn't see that before, where you have people like Peter Thiel.
Part of the American elite.
No, I'm talking about like Peter. I'm talking about Peter Thiel, who overtly is opposed to democracy, like in a very explicit way. I mean, he's very deeply. very deeply into, anti-democratic thinkers
Yeah.
and
Meanwhile, a
backs
lot of these billionaires
people
have
like
donated
Yarvin.
huge amounts of money to midterm campaigns, money that they'll never get back.
No, what I'm trying to say is that explains why people think
Yeah,
that
yeah,
there's
because
going to not be
they hear
democracy.
about one person, and meanwhile, if they were to go to Open
Well,
Secrets
there's
and
Elon
look at the
Musk too.
campaign donations and read about who's donating money to whom, there's loads of ordinary, everyday, large-scale political donations from all the various usual suspects. It's all proceeding in a relatively normal way. But
Yeah, well,
people don't. It's so
Elon
easy
Musk.
to see that. Yeah. Do they think that these billionaires just donate this money, never, and don't expect to see it again or have it have any effect? Why are these billionaires donating to 2026 midterm campaigns? If the elites in the country know that the elections are going to go away, why would they donate money for the 2026 campaigns? There's just all sorts of bleedingly obvious basic evidence that the 2026 midterms are going to happen. It's crazy to me that it has to be discussed. It's crazy. I think it's actually nuts. I think people who think that the 2026 midterms are not going to happen are at this point operating at a level of insanity, a kind of serious out of touch with reality thing is going on. But there's nothing you can say to these people to change their minds.
But to also play devil's advocate, we're in an era of hyperbole. So when people say stuff like that, it's really to get people to care and listen about what they're saying. And what I think they're really saying is not that there won't necessarily be elections, but there'll be efforts to change the rules in such a ways that favor the Republicans, such as, for example, requiring passports as part of your voter registration and, stuff that would make it harder to vote, which generally favors the Republicans.
They've got real ID. It's going to be real ID. It's not going to be passports. In places where they do that, it'll be real ID. And your driver's license in most of those states will count as real ID. If you've done the update to get the real ID driver's license, they're going to have the same sorts of requirements that you would take for a domestic flight in the United States. At this point, you have to have a real ID to get on a plane. So the real ID thing, in some places, they may do that.
Well, and also there's the ways in which other democracies in the world have become less democratic is not always through canceling elections or just one big change. Like Erdogan in Turkey, it's been a very gradual process.
He doesn't have
Turkey still has elections. Turkey still has elections.
They're not competitive. They haven't been competitive for quite a while, at least not at scale. And the evidence of competitive multi-party elections is that people sometimes lose. And in the United States, we just saw a competitive multi-party election in which somebody lost. And the presidential cycle before that, we saw a competitive multi-party election, which somebody lost. And the cycle before that, we saw a competitive multi-party election, which somebody lost. And we've seen the houses of Congress flip in competitive multi-party elections, which people have been losing, incumbents have lost. So, these people are saying all of a sudden it's all going to change because the United States is like Turkey, a country which has had numerous military coups over the last 30, 40 years. That has only been a democracy.
Yeah, he gets compared
for
to
how
India
long?
To Modi sometimes, or Orban.
Yeah.
Of course, Orban's likely to lose the next election, seems.
Orban, who's presiding over a very small country with heavily unified by the Hungarian language, which is a very bizarre language, which only a very small number of people speak. And you're talking about a post-Soviet country that's, again, been a democracy for less than 40 years. India, a country which is a developing country that has at best been a democracy since shortly after World War II, but which had the emergency in the 70s. This is a country that's had its constitution more than 2 centuries. It's going to take a lot in a country like that to put an end to competitive multi-party elections. I mean, even if you were to compare the United States with the UK, in the UK, they sometimes don't have elections when the country is at war, right?
Well, because
during
the prime
World War
minister
II,
can delay elections. It's normal.
Parliament can do anything in
Call
the
them,
UK.
yeah.
There's no constitutional limit to what Parliament can do. Parliament is sovereign and can pass any act it wants, right? Parliament can pass an act that declares Rwanda a safe place to send migrants. After the court in the UK said that it's not a safe place, Parliament can go, yes, it is. By statute, it must be regarded by all as a safe place. Parliament can decide what words mean with acts. The British system has a Hobbes quality to it that is often lost on people. Parliament can just decide what language means per British law. So, but even in comparison with that, and I think in the UK, it would be very difficult to get rid of competitive multi-party elections. I think that would be an enormously difficult thing to do within the UK. You might be able to delay an election during a large-scale war that the UK is in, but you wouldn't be able to permanently get rid of competitive multi-party elections in the UK. The United States is a much harder country to end competitive multi-party elections in than even the UK is, not just because of its internal political culture, its political history, but because of the functioning of its constitution. The constitutions of a lot of countries that have had executive aggrandizement lead to loss of competitive multi-party elections have emergency provisions in them. The US Constitution doesn't have emergency provisions in it. There's no one in the United States who can declare a state of emergency and suspend the Constitution. There's no functioning in the American legal system for that.
Yeah, so I'm done playing devil's advocate now. The other thing that I do acknowledge, though, is that there's, a very obvious attempt in which the Republicans want to manage democracy. But what I would say to that is, so have the Democrats. I mean, this is kind of the paradox of the American system, is that's ironically why it's so impossible for like any one party to really become hegemonic and not have a competitor, is because they both engage in ways of managing democracy, in the sense that the Republicans, they do so through like voter suppression, voter ID. The Democrats, I mean, well, there's the whole, very deliberately letting in unprecedented amount of illegal migrants, right? And under Biden. And, this is why the Republicans have frequently accused the Democrats of inflating immigration, because the Democrats, as they've admitted very openly, believe that demographics is destiny and that having more Latinos will lead to more voters for the Democratic Party, which itself, I mean, what is that if not an attempt to literally, manage democracy? And then there's other aspects which even leftists kind of are complicit in, an idea of power that would basically give the Democrats a dictatorship, like, for example, putting an end to the Electoral College. That is often posed as a more democratic solution, right? If you just put an end to the Electoral College. But then you would have a democratic dictatorship. You'd have the Democratic
It's
Party.
very difficult even to get rid of the Electoral College because it's baked into the constitutional law. And there hasn't been a constitutional amendment that has gone through in the United States since the early 90s. Yeah. The way that people handle this kind of stuff is that they always assume that the other side's gripes about the procedures are just pretend or lies or deliberately malicious, but their gripes about the procedures have something to do with democracy. And they can't possibly imagine that the other side has precisely the same view of it. The Republicans who worry about voter fraud really think that voter fraud is a problem. And you might be able to say that you have all sorts of evidence that it's not, therefore they must be lying. But they really do think that voter fraud is a problem. And the Republicans think that the Voting Rights Act gerrymanders southern states in a way that disadvantages them in those southern states. And they regard this as an infringement. And the Democrats say that if you don't use the Voting Rights Act in this way, that the racists in the South will gerrymander the states in such a way that Black people aren't able to significantly participate in the elections. And both of the sides genuinely believe what they say. Large numbers of people on both of the sides. It's possible that any given person might be saying something they don't believe for near-term advantage, but lots and lots of people believe the things that they say about voter suppression, about voter fraud. What do all these people have in common? What they have in common is that they want competitive multi-party elections. It's the only thing that all these people have in common. That's the one thing that's going to happen, for sure. There will be competitive multi-party elections.
And that's why dictatorship isn't really a great way to think about this, because the way in which, the American system functions is more like a cartel, like the two parties function like a
and
cartel.
People say two parties isn't multi. It is from the point of view of political science. In political
Yes.
science, competitive multi-party elections doesn't mean more than two. Two is enough to qualify by the standards of political science for
It's enough
competitive
for it to
multi-party.
not be a dictatorship.
Right. It's enough that incumbents can lose, and therefore incumbents have to fear defeat. As long as
Yes.
incumbents can lose and fear defeat, that mechanism, the possibility of losing the election influencing how you behave when you're in office, operates. In fact, a lot of the time when you have a two-party system, it's easier for the incumbent to lose than in a proportional representation system with a very large number of parties where the odds are you run the election nationally, you'll get roughly the same percentages each time out, where you'll change out the coalition partner for the main party, but the main party might be able to hang on with a different coalition partner. It's easier for parties in, say, Germany or the Netherlands to tell a story about how, yeah, the composition of the government will change at the next election, but we'll probably find a way to still be part of it, than you can in the United States, where it's straightforwardly either you win the presidency or you lose it. Either you hold the Senate or you don't. The two-party system has a clarity to it in terms of whether you won or lost that in PR with multiple parties you often don't have. But people can have their popular vote share go up, in countries, and then not actually replicate this level of success in terms of seats or in terms of position within the government. And then you can have arguments about how they did at the election based on whether you should care about gaining votes or whether you should care about gaining seats or whether you should care about gaining certain ministries within the coalition government or getting certain policies brought into the coalition government's plan. And it creates a lot of internal disputes about whether the elections were actually won or lost, and a lack of clarity about what it means to win or lose. One of the more esoteric arguments I make for why, actually two parties in some ways, you can argue, works better with this mechanism than 5 or 6 parties.
Well, some of the people who devised multi-party systems did so to contain labor parties. Like in the case of Denmark and Sweden, embraced multi-party systems because they thought the Labour Party in England was getting too powerful, and they didn't want a situation where that happened. And today, the British system is generally characterized to be less democratic, and in a literal sense, in a literal procedural sense, it is at the level of representation. But when people talk about democracy, they often, decide what is democratic based on what outcomes they want from that, right? But yeah, you're tempting me almost to bring this into the political science discussion, just because when we were talking about this, I thought about the Liberal Party in Canada, which is, loves to paint itself as pro-democratic. But I think the Liberal Party in Canada, really, I think is one of the most I would say the most impressive cartel party in history, aside from the LDP in Japan. The LDP in Japan is like a master cartel party that's like able to, have a democratic system and just maintain like power for so long. In Canada, it's the natural governing party. They call Liberal Party the natural governing party, partially for a reason. It's has the most powerful electoral machine, but it also engages in all kind of subtle tactics to manage democracy, right? Like it engages in, some degree of patronage, where often like, they'll just get checks in the mail, due to a policy right before the election, right? And people will be afraid of losing that, or they'll inflate the bureaucracy to be so big that people, feel that they'll lose their jobs if they vote for the other party. So you make Canada more like Cuba in that regard, which is pretty funny. Or you do this other thing, which is inflate the population and hope that the population will vote liberal. And you inflate the population in such a way that there's now diasporas who vote according to their diaspora more than they do according to ideology in any political sense. And thus you appeal to diasporas, like how the Liberal Party is masterfully, locked the Ukrainian diaspora, the Persian diaspora, the Indian diaspora, which is increasingly now even more fractured because as the rates of migration increase to a point where now you have the Sikh and Hindu conflicts coming here. But it's interesting because I actually think Mark Carney, part of why he supported, and this will be the segue back to Iran. I think Mark Carney, I genuinely think part of why Mark Carney came out in such loud support of the strikes on Iran is because of the Iranian diaspora in Canada. Like it's an electoral reason, which is quite big. And, they did have huge protests recently. And because it's like, this is Canada, and it's not, Canada hasn't always gone along with the US in foreign policy things. Jean Chrétien, for those who don't remember, decided not to, get involved in Iraq. And in today's, like, this is literally just a few weeks after the whole thing about Mark Carney's speech about the end of the world order and how we need to build independence from the US, and invoking this centrist version of Canadian nationalism, and how, like, Canadian and US relations were quite hostile. We just made like a deal with China, but like, they came in support for this. They really
Yeah,
didn't
because the
have to.
sign in the window was still up for NATO. As he said during the Q&A of that talk at Davos, the sign in the window, the speech, in that speech, he starts off with, in the Soviet Union, people used to post pro-communist signs in the window to show that they were committed to the regime. And then because they did that, they anticipated that they would be left alone and allowed to operate. And then eventually it got to the stage where people stopped putting up the sign in the window, and maybe it's time to take the sign down for the liberal international order and stop pretending that we believe in all of this, because it doesn't seem to work anymore. And people took this to be a very broad, very sweeping indictment. But I think it was mainly confined to the trade system, the WTO and the trade system, because in the Q&A itself of that talk, he said that the sign was remaining in the window for now for NATO. So he said that Canada remained committed to the existing transatlantic alliance system, which means...
And that's how he justifies supporting Iran. But of course, NATO countries they're supporting the attacks on Iran, but that they didn't always support everything like the US did. Like, neither France or Germany also, in addition to Canada, didn't support the Iraq war effort, and they're part of NATO, right? So it's
Yeah,
like,
if anything, the NATO countries have become more docile in foreign policy and
yes,
more willing to support U.S. military interventions, with the exception, obviously, of the Greenland thing, in which they got to seem to stand up to the United States. For instance, right now, Starmer seems to be in the UK trying to present himself as being in opposition to this behavior. But it was clear at the outset that he just wasn't a party to it. He wasn't really consulted. He wasn't really involved. And now, since he's not involved, he might as well oppose it and call for a resolution. But he didn't oppose it before it happened or speak out against it in the weeks leading up to this, when there would have been an opportunity to try to use UK influence, insofar as it exists, to affect what takes place. He waited instead until it began, and then he said that he doesn't support it, isn't part of it. In the case of the German chancellor said that we should not criticize our allies at a time where they can do things that we can't do. And they can achieve objectives that we share, but are not capable of pursuing ourselves. And then Merz went and met with Trump and criticized Spain for not increasing its defense spending. And then meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron made that viral video of him singing the Marseillaise with all of his guys in front of the French nuclear submarine that they dredged up from what looks like a bottomless pit to hell. Did you see that video? Oh, it was going all over the internet. It was haunting because it's echoing in the industrial facility, the singing of the Marseillaise, and they're singing it in a very, not in a boisterous or joyful way, but in a kind of haunting, miserable way, to go with the nuclear weapon. And then he gives this speech about how France is going to have more nuclear weapons, and he won't say how many more, because France is no longer going to disclose how many nuclear weapons it has.
they also supported the strikes on Iran.
Yes. They do all this Gaullist imagery and performing and peacocking, but then in practice, there's no real substantive independence. And that's the Gaullism in France has always been this performance of independence that really doesn't go very far.
I think
at the end of the
they
day.
do actually have independence. I think it's just, they also just have interests in wanting to,
They have some
contain
independence.
the
They can
Iranian
make
regime.
a case. They can make a case that their nuclear program is more independent from the United States than, for instance, the UK's is. They can, but in practice, France has become more predictable in terms of its support for U.S. policy in the Middle East than it was 20 years ago.
Because they also have their own, like, imperialist interests as well.
Well, they had those 20 years ago, but
They
one of the
they
things
want
that has happened is
they want
France has
America to.
become
Yeah.
much more concerned about terrorism, Islamic terrorism, than it was in the early 2000s because of the things that have taken place in France, the events that have taken place in France. French political culture has become more American over the last 20 years with respect to these issues.
Well, there's also the legitimation aspect, which is that France wants to, have its endeavors in Africa be legitimated. They don't want NATO states, especially America, to criticize what they do in Africa. And I think that's
That's
what he
true.
was alluding to when he said that message. He shared on Twitter the message to Trump about how, we can work together. We accomplish great things together. We,
Yeah. 20
sounded
years
like
ago,
kind of
though,
like,
they could pursue those African interests while still at the same time opposing the Iraq War. And now it would be a lot to ask of France to put up a real stink about one of these interventions. And part of the story is that the Europeans were major cheerleaders for the Libyan intervention. And they got,
yeah.
Obama even faults them and blames them for talking him into it in
Well,
his
they're the
memoir.
initiators. Yeah,
Yeah.
France was the initiator
Uh-huh.
under Sarkozy.
Yeah. So once the Americans helped them start that, now there's an expectation, and has been for a while, that they're going to be more compatible on Middle Eastern interventions. And it seems to be the case that they are more willing to go along. I think also the Russian threat makes them
Yes.
more committed to keeping America engaged with them. And their desire to keep America engaged with Europe causes them to be more supportive of American policy in the Middle East.
Yeah, in the case of Canada, though, it seems like their only objective interest, aside from the political part of winning the Iranian diaspora, which is that's a big voting block, and people don't realize because that voting block could easily be swallowed entirely by the Conservative Party, who's super pro-Israel and hawkish. And the Liberal Party, though, what it is successfully good at appealing more than the Conservatives is it's great at appealing to minority groups because it has a very vague multiculturalist view that's non-antagonistic to like people's different values, and it's great at like doing token representation in a way that the Conservative Party is still seen by a lot of people to still be like too white, right? And so there's a political interest, but I also think you could also say that this is a way of Mark Carney subtly trying to get the U.S. to ease up on Canada by supporting this effort.
Of course.
Because there's
All
also
that stuff is
we saw that
connected.
because we saw that with Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is like its own conflict that was happening before. Something interesting where the Afghanis offered to send troops against Iran to or at least to contribute in the fight against Iran, which is weird because the only plausible reason for that would be they want the Americans to like help Pakistan back off from Afghanistan.
Yeah, they think that they can get the Americans, I think, to get the Pakistanis to back off of them if they offer to work with the Americans with respect to destabilizing Iran. Because the Taliban has a history of working with the United States to destabilize its other states in the region. In the case of the Soviet Union in the 80s, the Taliban is always interested in opportunities to get the Americans to be less hostile. And there is a possibility that what Pakistan is doing over there is coming with some encouragement from the United States. It's entirely possible.
So it could be that, or it could just be a spineless attempt. Either way, the Liberal Party doesn't seem to be, because there was a bit of a backpedaling. I don't know if you saw, like yesterday, where Carney said, "We said with regret that we support these strikes on Iran. A theocratic, blah blah blah." You went in the thing about how bad the regime was, but and he threw in something about peace and dangers.
Trump doesn't
And so
care
he
what
wanted
you
to really,
to your domestic public. Nobody cares what Carney says to the domestic public to legitimate it to the public. The question is, does he make a contribution at the material level?
No, I don't think he is. That's why I think that this is really about, winning the diaspora at the end of the day.
Yeah, does Canada make a contribution? And to what degree does Canada contribute? There's some possibility that that will be noticed with respect to trade negotiations. Though Trump has often in the past trivialized, I mean, not that long ago, he did this with respect to the Danes, the military contributions of U.S. allies. When U.S. allies point to their military contributions as reasons that they should be given economic preferential treatment or given a little bit more room to maneuver economically, the Trump administration tends to be not very friendly about that. Now, he got a rebuke from King Charles for having made that comment about NATO allies, and then he was quick to clarify that he wasn't really referring to the UK. He was really talking about the Danes. The UK has always been great, he said. But now Starmer doesn't seem to be looking to contribute at an operational level to what's going on over there. Apart from, I think there's one boat that the British sent to Cyprus, and the Greeks sent some boats to Cyprus. But again, that's defending Cyprus, which is not really the same thing as getting involved directly in what's taking place in Iran. And there's also the question of Turkey and to what degree the Iranian strike on Turkey can be used to leverage NATO states into making larger contributions. Because Turkey is a NATO member state. And if you attack a NATO member state, all NATO member states are pushed by that.
So this is what I really don't understand about Iran's response, because the strikes on Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, UAE, Saudi bases, American bases in those areas makes complete sense because they want to deter those countries in the future from, leaving their airspace and allowing the U.S. to use them to more easily attack Iran. So it's a kind of deterrence. But I really don't understand why attack Turkey or anything, related to Turkish military, because Israel is quite antagonistic to Turkey as well. And just the last few weeks, members of parliament, like the former prime minister of Israel, Bennett, said that the greatest threat to Israel after Iran is Turkey, right? It's like, so I'm confused a little bit about what Iran's thinking there, because Erdogan is reported to be highly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and highly antagonistic to Israel, even if in practice he does not do anything to counter Israeli interests.
Yeah, Turkey is the other state in the region that has projected power outside of its own territory in recent years. I mean, I mentioned, this is more than an hour ago now, but I mentioned Turkey making a deployment to Libya, back in 2020. So Turkey is a state which has some ability. Yeah, Syria as well, obviously. But, not just immediately on its border even, but to, take guys on a boat, stick them in Tripoli, that's power projection, right? So Turkey is the other state which has some ability to do that right now. And of course, Egypt is a state that one might look at as a state that could in principle project power in the region. Although Egypt has made peace with Israel and has been relatively cooperative with Israel, although not to the point of permitting Israel to expel large numbers of Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt has not gone along with that. Egypt constructed a camp so that in the event that there was an influx of Gazans into Egypt, Egypt would have infrastructure to deal with that, but as a contingency plan, not with the intent of permitting Israel to do that. And I think Egypt was looking to get paid. If Egypt was to take on that task, it wanted to be well compensated for it. And the amount Egypt would have to be compensated greatly exceeded what anybody was willing to pay. I think these were all factors in why the Gazan population was not expelled to a camp in the Sinai Peninsula. Although that was considered and contingencies for that were, not just thought about or talked about, but built at the level of physical objects. I think that it's not really very sensible for Iran to do these strikes. And I would even include a lot of the strikes on the U.S. bases, because ultimately Iran is not going to succeed in debilitating the American capacity to project power into Iran. And there's a risk in staging these attacks that you might cause more states in the region to commit more firmly to some sort of change of power. When you're kind of indiscriminately firing at lots of different countries, regardless of the recent diplomatic status. Yeah,
And the Qatar,
I think it's a risky
the
thing.
Qatar one is
striking
strange.
Oman.
Why Qatar? Because Qatar is trying to like broker
Right, Qatar is trying
negotiation.
to mediate, but of course, Qatar also works with the United States. The
I guess
Iranians,
like the UAE makes more sense because there's a far more likely that that would work because of the tourism that and their reputation of
it's more
being a
disruptive
safe
to the
space.
UAE.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more disruptive, but ultimately the UAE is not going to alter its foreign policy position with respect to Iran because Iran fires some of these missiles in the direction of the UAE. For one, a lot of the stuff, while there is a certain amount of damage that is being caused, a lot of the stuff that the Iranians are flinging is not succeeding in causing an enormous amount of damage. What it does do is it
They've been
compels these states
intercepted
to use
so far.
interceptor. Yeah. And so there's a financial cost that it imposes by compelling states to use weapons to intercept or to protect themselves from Iranian munitions. But I think what it has allowed is for many states to frame the Iranians as part of the tit for tat. So, for instance, a lot of European allies criticize the Iranians for striking states in the region. And when they're doing that, they're talking about things like Cyprus. These are targets that the allied states consider totally illegitimate. And so when Iran strikes targets that the allied states consider illegitimate, this makes the allied states that are at a greater distance from Iran significantly more willing to potentially contribute. And I think that those strikes played a significant role in getting Europeans to offer material support, or to at least make it clear that they've not ruled out material support in principle.
Like Germany
Yeah.
is offered now.
Well, Germany
think,
has made it
Spain
pretty clear
has.
that they think this is something that MERS would like to see done. MERS has made it clear that what the United States is doing is something that he would have liked to do, but doesn't have the capability to do. MERS is the one who took it that far.
Classic German.
And MERS has been all over the place.
I just find it funny,
lately.
like, it's just like, seriousness aside, I just find it so funny that when the Americans were asking the Europeans to spend more on military, and they said, okay, even the Germans, you should spend more on military. And they're like, we will build the biggest military ever. They just, I mean, did you see the statement? They said, we'll build the biggest military in Europe. I just find that pretty funny. It's just the Germans.
And part of it is the Ukraine thing, right? The Ukraine thing creates this sense of a pressing threat. And the Ukraine war has allowed the United States to pressure these states into not just meeting the original 2% target, but into raising the target, which is astounding. And these are countries, many of them used to not even pay the 2% target. And now they not only are paying the 2% target, they've agreed to raise the target. And the Germans have explicitly encouraged the United States to take a punitive attitude to Spain for not taking steps to meet the new target. So it's not just that you have to meet the 2%, you have to raise the target, you actually have to take steps to meet the new target. And the Germans are at the forefront of pushing that, not just for themselves, but for other states in Europe, including those states that are reluctant. They are insisting that this is part of the fiscal rules, actually. This is actually part of the European Union fiscal rules now, that you can break the fiscal rules for military spending. So you can spend in excess of what the fiscal targets would typically permit, only if you can justify it as part of meeting the defense spending target. Which means you can do stimulus, but it's got to be military stimulus. You have to be able to frame it as military spending. If it's public services, doesn't count.
Maybe that's how they'll solve climate.
Oh,
that's what I've been saying for a while, is that climate is not going to they're not going to make any progress on climate until the military just does it. Because it's the only institution with the capacity and legitimacy and spending power connected to the federal government that could do that in many states.
It's going to make it hard for the Europeans to meet those climate goals if they're trying to rearm in a short unit of time. It's going to make it hard.
Or they could just not use the money on arming, and it could just go plant more trees.
Yeah, this thing that happened over the summer, where they agreed to raise the NATO target. This I thought was absolutely mad, and I think it's just suicidal for the future of Europe. To raise that military defense spending target up to the target is 5%, 3.5 medium term, but 5% long term.
So
They're going
Spain,
to all the social programs are going to go broke. All of the welfare programs are going to go broke. The infrastructure is going to fall apart. These countries are not going to be able to sustain the model of life that we associate with Europe if they actually meet these defense spending targets.
yeah, especially because they're on the damn euro. They don't have any significant monetary sovereignty. But Spain has been one of the few countries that has rejected, a lot of Trump's demands on.
They're sending a cruiser to Cyprus, though. It's defending a fellow European state. That's how they pass it off. But it's also a way of acknowledging that you have obligations.
Right, but he's condemned the war. He's also been one of the harshest to condemn Israel, up there with like South Africa in terms of, the role they've played at the, United Nations and condemning what happened in Gaza, what's happening in Gaza still. And with the war now, this is kind of a segue to the next part of our discussion, which is on a topic we introduced before called Neo-Leftism, the Neo-Left,
yeah.
and whether Spain is an example of the neo-left or not, because Spain is interesting. I find Spain very interesting because it's one of the only places where the left actually wins. It's still in an advanced Western democracy where the left is winning. I mean, it is, after all, the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain that rules in a coalition, and Pedro Sánchez is quite one of the more popular leaders in Europe at the moment, at least for the standards of people who are left of center. But what is his domestic policy? Because also Spain happens to be one of the most attractive countries in Europe for foreign investment, and is one of the highest performing economies in Europe at the moment. So it's like, okay, what is Spain exactly? In terms of what is the left in Spain believe? What do they govern like? Are they an example of this sort of Mamdani, neo-leftism? We're going to discuss that in the back room, which you should be part of if you haven't already. We have many exclusive episodes. Some of the last few exclusive episodes we did, Ben, are quite good, and you get access to 100 episodes now of exclusive content. So you should become part of the back room. People will attest that it's very worth it. And this is how you support this show while making it immune to audience capture, because that's where we put the most controversial stuff is in the back room, even more controversial, so that I don't have people who cancel just because they don't get the political opinion they didn't like.
Yeah, if people cancel because I said that there will be competitive multi-party elections this year, that would be a real shame. Talk about things that shouldn't be controversial.
The backroom people, they pay for good quality educational material, not for feeling good. That's the explicit thing. So, if you want to get validated, it's not for you. But if you like this, you'll like what's in the back room. So see you there. All right.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life.